informal few minutes, I'll just ask David to introduce himself, say a few words about his good and bad experiences with PSI. And he's then going to talk us through some of the big themes that he's dealing with, and I'm hoping we can have a lively discussion through to 5 p.m. if David cares to stay with us that long. Very special place in my heart because David is Zimbabwean, my favorite country on the planet. So over to David. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much indeed, Krishna and everybody. I noticed without paying a lot of attention, this talk has a really big title, something like The Future of AIDS. I also remember Krishna and I had a nice informal discussion, and I said I wouldn't bring slides, and it would just be a discussion. So we're going to be talking about the future of AIDS without any slides, and it's going to rely a lot on you guys, because I genuinely have no prepared remarks. So why don't we just start an informal discussion?
Any burning questions? I'll go first then, David.
Yeah.
So one of the very interesting things that you mentioned in your in the chat we had about a week ago, this was to inform PSI's new HIV strategic plan, and you very kindly agreed to speak with us, was that you anticipate that with declines in incidence, HIV incidence and burden of disease globally, you will also anticipate that funding will start going down. That's been a topic of some discussion, likely or less likely. I'm just wondering whether you'd like to comment on whether that is happening, why you think it's happening, and what PSI could do to prepare for a shift.
I think that's a question we're all looking at, and I think there may be a couple of dimensions to it. I think there's no question that in some parts of the world, declines in new HIV infections mean that we've succeeded, and as a result, there's less international attention to the issue. The best example is India, where India has almost certainly reduced its epidemic by about 60 to 70%, and that proportion appears to be growing. And in the process of succeeding as much as we have, it's definitely reduced it as a development parity, to the extent where the Indian government is now financing 92% of the entire HIV program from domestic resources, and the only other contributor is the bank at 80%. And we're lucky and glad still to be contributing through a new program. But I think that the main issue is not simply the success that we've had in some regions. I think the main issue is the structure of global health funding. And I think you know better than me that one of the Obama administration's goals was to reduce global reliance on the US government as a funder of AIDS programs. And when that policy began about 4 years ago, the US government was about 50% of global HIV financing. After 4 years of that diplomacy, they're about 70 to 75%. And so, you know, if you listen to people like Laurie Garrett, realistically, global health is more than ever before, and HIV in particular, a US initiative. So it's hard to overstate how much the future of HIV financing relies on US policy. My own very clear view is Europe is going to be, with the exception of the UK and the Scandinavians, is not going to be a major donor for the foreseeable future. It's really clear that it's a choice between Greek pensions, Greek jobs, the euro, and development, and that's an easy contest. And we've seen how much ODA has shrunk in much of Europe in the last year or two. So I guess my response to you is I think that everything depends on what the US government does, and I think that it is going to be a question of making better use of existing money. And we also mentioned the opportunity to try and use HIV investments for as many different platforms as possible, which you're already doing. And I think that will be the way for the future. I know when we have spoken in our research to USA, anything we can mention on integration that we can use to show that the HIV investments are having impacts in other areas, they really do seize upon and use domestically. So you know this all better than me. So yeah, that would be my first comment.
You started out really easy with a softball question there.
Well, I have a question following on that. My name is Katja Peterson. I'm a researcher in RNA. I've been following a lot about the BRIC countries and how well they're doing economically, and they're like, what global recession, you know? But one of the things that has come up that people have asked is, well, what are you contributing then to the greater good, being that Russia has plenty of money that they could throw at this, so does Brazil. What do you see, what are your thoughts on their contribution presently, and what do you think for the future of their contribution?
Sure. Well, I think the statistic I would always use to begin this discussion is that by many accounts, China's ex-Im Bank is now a bigger development funder to Africa than the entire World Bank.
Wow.
It's enormous, but that investment is almost always in infrastructure, and it's almost always to secure mineral resources. India is following suit with a larger international program that also focuses a lot on access to energy, access to mineral resources. We attended an MGG6 meeting, in fact co-organized at the request of the Russian government, because Russia wants to become a donor. And it's a very good example in that case of be careful what you wish for. Because Russia almost certainly wants to use its role as a donor to impose its own policies on the co-prosperity sphere that Putin is rebuilding, in other words, the near abroad as he calls it. And we've already seen the really negative impacts of Russian influence on Ukrainian policy in areas like harm reduction. The same in Central Asia. So I can't imagine that Russia will be a positive donor for HIV. Although I think for other MDGs that are not as contentious, it's something one would certainly look to in its own backyard in Central Asia. And the bank has actually now got several trust funds from the Russians to focus on areas like outbreaks, disease surveillance, and public health issues. So I certainly think that there's going to be opportunities to target Russia for funding in Central Asia, in its near abroad, in areas other than HIV. But I would reaffirm the poor policy, just the negative policy implications of greater Russian involvement. The best case in many ways is Brazil. It's a small fact, but Brazil is already the largest donor to the Guinea-Bissau health program. It's larger than Portugal, the EU, or any of the others. We work a lot with Brazil, and Brazil was on the verge of taking out the World Bank's first ever loan for South-South collaboration. The idea was Brazil was going to borrow 30 million, Angola was, Mozambique was going to borrow 6 million, entirely for a knowledge exchange partnership. And the reason they thought the bank had a role is that it could help to bridge them and link them to other sources of knowledge. So Brazil's extremely interested in knowledge transfer, in being recognized as an influential country, in being seen as a leader on human rights, on equity, in being recognized for the major achievements it's made. Its focus is clearly Latin America and the Lusophone world. I think it's promising. The challenges one faces in Brazil is, even in Brazil, we've seen that with the withdrawal of international funders, and the bank is the only external financier of Brazil's AIDS program, and the amount of money we put in is just negligible. It's 40 million over 5 years when Brazil's domestic budget is $1 billion a year. So it's infinitesimal. We can talk about why they asked for it later, but Brazil's not been able to take over the funding of its domestic NGOs who are involved in really important services since funders have withdrawn. So we're not there yet. The final point I'd make in relation to the BRICS in this regard is that DIFID did something I think quite anticipatory. They changed their Beijing office from an office providing aid to China to an office coordinating aid to Africa with China. And DIFID had a request from the Chinese in the Congo to partner, where the Congo are building roads, DIFID would work on the social development and health dimensions. So I think there are creative opportunities. The very final point to make is I think a really important thing that BRICS have done, which makes it easier for global health and HIV funding, is they've really picked up their own domestic financing in the last 5 years. And India, I've given you the 92%, Brazil must be 99%, South Africa is nearly entirely funding its own HIV program. And confidentially, the South Africans will say that they think they can do without PEPFAR, but they don't want to say that too loudly because they would still like to have them.
Of course.
Yeah. The last point to note is we were at the South African Embassy yesterday briefly, and there was a meeting of all African ambassadors in Washington to discuss the issue of declining PEPFAR resources and what it meant for them. And the conclusions were interesting. They were saying that if PEPFAR is leaving as quickly as it appears to, they would like to change the nature of the aid relationship, and they would want to focus more on support for drug production facilities, which I'm not sure is a good idea at all, but just where the discussion was going. much more on strengthening training and learning facilities, on building human resources, on things that they see as more sustainable. So just to keep that in mind. So I think the bottom line is I don't think the BRICS are going to make up for the gaps that the rest of Europe is leaving, although there will be selective opportunities.